controversial in modern psychology, the intelligence of races. Do different racial groups have differences in intelligence, and if so, are these inherited? In a few moments, Professor Hans Eysenck will present his ideas to our audience, which includes half a dozen scientists working in similar fields, who haven't necessarily come to the same conclusions. They'll have an opportunity, after Professor Eysenck has spoken, to comment on his ideas and discuss them with him. This is a problem where we need facts and not emotions, and I'm here to see fair play and also to tell you a little more about the man we'll meet in a moment or two. Hans Eysenck is no stranger to controversy. He has never been content to remain in the calm backwaters of psychology. Whereas the work of many experimental psychologists is at least one stage removed from the study of human behavior, he prefers to make a broad and direct assault on the aspect of psychology that interests him most, human personality and the reasons for individual differences. The idea of conditioning, a legacy from Pavlov, lies at the back of much of Eysenck's work. And in more general terms, the physical side of our psychological makeup plays a large part in his theorizing. An important aspect of the differences between individuals is their intelligence. It is research on the nature of intelligence that Eysenck has become interested in the topic he'll be talking about tonight.
I'll go into the next room. You have 10 minutes to finish this section of the test. And I'll go into the next room and time it, all right?
Okay, fine.
Start now.
Intelligence tests play an important part in this work, and Eysenck goes on from finding out the IQs of large groups of subjects to study other aspects of the way they behave. He's a laboratory psychologist, and in this project, Eysenck is trying to link up IQ with the physiological activity of the brain. These minute electrical waves reflect the activity of millions of brain cells, and Professor Eysenck has found that they react to a short burst of noise in different ways, which, he believes, depend on the IQ of the subject. In other words, he believes that there may be measurable physical differences between people with high intelligence and those with low intelligence. If there are physiological correlates of intelligence, then it's possible that they're inherited. And it's the thorny problem of the heritability of intelligence that has provided a battleground for psychologists and geneticists over many years. The latest skirmish in this area, dealing with race and intelligence, has blown up in the last couple of years through the work of Professor Arthur Jensen, an American psychologist who has been a pupil of Eysenck's. Tonight, Eysenck takes up the banner raised in a recent book and presents his views on the intelligence of racial groups and the genetic background to their development. Professor Hans Eysenck.
There's a lot of factual evidence to suggest that IQ scores of American Negroes are lower than those of American whites. Figure 1 shows one particular study that has been done in that field. You see there the sort of differences found in school children. The whites have a mean IQ of 102 in this sample. The black children have an IQ of 81 on the average in this sample. Now, these are children coming from the southern states of America. In the north, the difference would be rather less, averaging out over the whole country to about 15 points of IQ. Now, I am concerned with the reasons for these differences, and the evidence contained in hundreds of research reports, books, journal articles, and so on, has forced me to abandon the view I used to hold that all the differences could be explained in terms of environmental factors and disadvantages suffered by the Negroes. Now, before turning to this evidence, I want to make one important point. I have always been opposed to any form of segregation or discrimination based on color, race, sex, religion, or anything else. and I see no reason whatsoever to alter this view because of any scientific evidence that may be forthcoming. This is a moral problem, not a factual one. Nevertheless, the factual question remains and requires to be answered if we wish to do the best we can for our black brethren and help them to advance to higher levels of socioeconomic status and education. First, we must face the question, can we measure IQ at all? Or is it too evanescent a concept to succumb to scientific thumbscrews? Intelligence, as psychologists see it, is essentially the ability to think abstractly. Good tests of intelligence are designed to present a series of problems, graded in difficulty, that concentrate on discovering the relations obtaining between certain elements, like simple words, numbers, or shapes, and then applying these relations in some novel fashion. So, for example, a typical problem of moderate complexity would be this set of figures: 2 complete rows of 3 drawings and 1 incomplete, where the person doing the test has to indicate which is the correct figure to complete the 3rd line. The reasoning processes that mediate the relations between the first line and the second, each, for example, has a square and a circle and a triangle as outline, are or should be common to a wide cross-section of humans. And so are the processes that lead to the observation that it is a circle that's missing from the last line. Similarly, more observation and reasoning would spot similar properties in the order of the small figures contained in the outline. Shapes like triangles and circles and squares should be equally familiar to people from a wide range of nations and backgrounds. We have to make our tests culture fair if we are hoping to test IQ in people from widely different backgrounds. An example of a test which is not culture fair would be an item in a type of test known as a picture vocabulary. Here, a picture is presented and the subject has to pick out the correct name in the list underneath. A picture of a dog and the word dog, or a picture of an eagle and the word eagle. However, with this item in the test, you'd have to have a pretty special sort of background to pick out the right name. And if you didn't know that the animal was an aardvark, it wouldn't necessarily be because you had a low IQ. There are thus no culture-free tests of intelligence. This is universally admitted. But tests differ in the degree to which they are culture fair. That is to say, the degree to which they are contaminated by educational and culture-determined factors. This enables us to test hypotheses about the genetic contribution to racial differences. If these are produced entirely by environmental influences, then the less culture-fair tests should show them up particularly clearly, while culture-fair tests should reduce them to a minimum. Tests of educational achievement, which are least culture-fair, should produce the greatest differences. This notion of a continuum of culture fairness is a very important one to my argument, and I'll be coming back to it later on. Now, whatever the precise nature of intelligence may be, and we know this as little as we know the precise nature of gravitation or of the strong force in physics, it is clearly important to know the degree to which individual differences in intelligence are determined by heredity, that is to say, are predetermined by the genes and chromosomes in the fertilized egg, and the degree to which environmental influences can alter these. 100% hereditarians do not exist. No one denies the importance of environment. This leaves us with 2 positions: 100% environmentalists who deny any importance to heredity, and the interactionist position, which I would personally adhere to, which says that heredity and environment interact to produce observable behavior, such as is shown in IQ tests. Now, one of the most fruitful ways of separating out the influence of heredity and environment is through the study of identical twins. Over the years, a number of scientists in this country and abroad have studied identical twins because of their absolute genetic identity. In order to find out how intelligence is determined, a search has been made to find twins who were separated at or near birth and brought up in different environments to test for differences in intelligence which would, if they existed, be entirely due to the differences in environment, because the genetic components of their intelligence would of course be identical. These two, for example, were separated as babies and brought up 100 miles apart, one in a northern town noted for its railway junction, and the other in a light industrial town in southern England. There was no contact between them until the age of 30, and up till then they were brought up by different foster parents, and each went to a variety of different schools. Many pairs of previously separated twins like these have been discovered over the years, and when tested for intelligence, their IQs have generally been found to be much closer together than would be expected to happen by chance, almost as close as if they had been brought up together in the same family. In other words, in two genetically identical people who have been brought up in different environments, the effect of the environment on their IQ has been relatively small. In fact, we can work out mathematically the likely comparative effects of heredity and environment, of nature and nurture, and it comes to roughly, very roughly, 3/4 for heredity and 1/4 for environment. And there's much other evidence to support these figures. Some geneticists feel that such a numerical estimate involves too many unproved assumptions, and the precise figures quoted above are not essential to my argument. The facts, I believe, leave no doubt that heredity plays a very important part in determining individual differences in IQ, and that is all that is required. Now, do these and similar facts regarding the importance of heredity in the determination of IQ lead us to the conclusion that the observed differences between American Negroes and American whites are largely due to heredity? I have argued in my book that the answer to this must be no. We cannot extrapolate from one group which has one sort of background and environment to another group. All the studies practically that have been done on heredity have been done on whites only and not on blacks. Even if exactly the same kind of relations were found in Negroes as have been found in whites, nevertheless, you cannot go from one group to the other without trying out types of experiments that have never been done so far. However, what we can do, and this I suggest is a very important kind of thing to do, we can make deductions from the alternative view, that is the purely environmentalist view, and see whether these deductions are in fact borne out by the fact. Now, as I shall try to suggest to you, when these assumptions are tested, they simply do not work out. The evidence does not support the purely environmentalist type of argument. Let me first of all deal with a very important range of studies, namely those in which the socioeconomic status of the two groups being compared was equated by taking white and black children living next to each other in the same environment, going to the same schools, earning the same amount of money, and as far as possible having the same general background. Under those conditions, the differences between white and black children were slightly reduced, something like 3 points from 15 to 12, but not very much. The difference is still very large. When you carry this even further and compare the IQ of middle-class Negro children with the IQs of working-class white children, in other words, where the social and environmental and educational advantages are all in favor of the black children, there is still a difference slight, admittedly, in favor of the white children. In other words, although you have done more than equate the environmental effects, you have actually weighted them in favor of the Negro children. In favor of the Negro children. Nevertheless, the difference still remains in the direction we had found before.
Would you like to hear the discussion? I think you'll find these gentlemen here are going to put the very point of view. May we now hear Professor Eysenck, and then there will be others able to discuss it.
When we compare the children of middle-class Negroes with the children of working-class whites, in other words, a situation in which all the environmental advantages in schooling, socioeconomic status, building, housing, and so on, are in favor of the Negroes, nevertheless, there is still a slight advantage to the children of the white working-class groups. And this is very difficult to account for in environmentalist terms. Now let me turn to another argument, which I think is also a very important one, and that is a point I made before about differences in culture fairness between different tests. On the argument that the Negroes do poorly because of environmental and educational disadvantages, you would expect that they would do least well compared to whites in verbal tests and tests having a lot of cultural and social points built into them, and that they would do best, comparatively speaking, on culture fair tests. In actual fact, exactly the opposite has been observed on a number of occasions. It is very interesting to compare in this way the differences between Negro and white children and also the scores of Mexican children in the United States who come from even poorer homes on the whole than do the Negroes, and who of course also have very great environmental disadvantages. What you find is that Negroes do rather better on verbal and educational tests than they do on nonverbal tests of abstractability. In other words, the more culture fair the test, the lower do Negroes in fact score. This is exactly the opposite pattern to that expected on the environmentalist hypothesis. Mexican children in the United States, on the other hand, conform precisely to the environmental deprivation pattern. They do much better on culture fair tests than on verbal and scholastic tests. Now the next figure shows the results of white, black, and Mexican children on a picture vocabulary test, very much contaminated by cultural influences. Note the superiority of the Negroes to the Mexicans. The next figure shows results on a culture fair test. Note that now the Mexicans are superior to the Negroes, in spite of the fact that in socioeconomic status and educational facilities, the Mexicans are greatly inferior to the Negroes. Again, this finding is very difficult to explain on environmentalistic grounds. So what are the conclusions we may come to? As I said before, the direct genetic evidence is only suggestive. Until we get to know more about the precise mode of inheritance of intelligence, it is unlikely to become conclusive. The evidence on the environmentalist side seems to be so much at variance with the predictions made by environmentalists themselves that the traditional position has become very difficult to maintain, that all the observed differences are due to environmental factors, education, and so on. All the results that I have reviewed here and in my book are much more in line with an interactionist position, which recognizes that genetic differences play an important part in the causation of observed differences in IQ between the races, but of course do not cause all the observed differences. Now, this tentative conclusion can't, of course, be extrapolated to other countries or other colored groups. It does not tell us anything about the position of colored groups in this country, for instance, because very little research has been done on this problem over here. And you cannot assume that what is true of one racial group in one country is true of another racial group in another country. Thank you.
Well, environment or heredity, this is not an all or nothing question, and Professor Eysenck believes that intelligence is due to an interaction between environment and heredity. However, the crux of the matter is a quantitative one, and a lot of people feel that his figure of 75 or 80% due to hereditary is an overestimate, while others question whether it's possible to quantify such an ill-defined property anyway. These are all points which straddle the frontiers of genetics, psychology, and sociology. And we have a number of people here this evening who thought about the topic of race and intelligence and who don't necessarily agree with Professor Eysenck's approach. First, we have a strong band of geneticists. Professor Lionel Penrose, Emeritus Professor of Human Genetics at University College London. Walter Bodmer, Professor of Genetics at Oxford, and Professor John Thurday, who's head of the Department of Genetics at Cambridge. Then a sociologist, Professor John Rex from the University of Warwick, and a psychologist, Dr. Martin Richards of the Department of Psychology at Cambridge, and finally John Vasey of the Department of Economics at Brunel University. Professor John Rex, I think you feel worried about the possibility of separating the environment.
Well, my position is that I'm a sociologist, a white South African liberal politically, that I was a signatory of the UNESCO statement on the nature of race and racism, and therefore, reading Professor Eysenck's book, my beliefs must be reduced to the fact that I believe that all the differences between men are solely due to something which is quite simplistically definable as environment. I'm supposed to believe, presumably, in a man with no genes at all, made of some sort of plasticine on which various molds can be put, representing socioeconomic status, schooling, urban environment, and so on. And if, in fact, the plasticine doesn't make the same marks on two, then it's all due to some kind of baking powder underneath, which is genetic. Well, of course, nobody who is a sociologist, nobody who is a signatory of any of the UNESCO statements, very few people who are politically liberal say any such thing. In fact, we talk about in the interaction between genetic and social causes. We talk about the possibility of the difference between isolated groups becoming genetic populations with genetic differences between them. But what Professor Eysenck does, claiming to be an interactionist, which he's not, is to produce a very shoddy argument from a scientific point of view, which basically is an argument in terms of residues. He simply says the environmentalists are disproved by showing that if you take Negroes and whites of equal socioeconomic status, schooling, house type, etc., you will find that there are still significant differences amongst them. And these people are the same socially. Then he says, well, let the environmentalists, so-called, come up with other factors in the environment which might be investigated. Now, I suggest in all seriousness that you can't begin to investigate what those other factors in the so-called environment are without looking at the social structure of the society under investigation. And it is a fact that people whose ancestors were brought into the societies as slaves, people who were driven into reserves and given a sort of tolerated status, people who came in as trading people or something of this kind, all of these have a different relationship to the society. Now, if you really want to control the environmental variable. I would suggest, I think, this experiment, and this is really, I mean, seriously speaking in scientific terms, in the terms that Professor Eysenck calls experimental, what you would have to do on this question of Negro-white differentials is to conduct an experiment in which the peoples of Africa conquered and enslaved the peoples of Northwest Europe and America, transported millions of them to Africa under conditions in which 2/3 of them died, in which their culture was totally destroyed so that they had to survive in the culture of their black masters. And in these circumstances, I suppose there would be some black social scientist who was arguing against the environmentalists and showing that the whites who came from good neighborhoods did just as badly as the whites who came from bad neighborhoods.